actually get access. Turns out it's actually very easy on Twitter. For apologies if you hear my cat in the background, by the way. She's got a lot of energy right now. She just ate. So Twitter is fairly easy to get access to. Some are not. It also depends on your particular use case. So we'll start with the plan. I'll go through what is an API, walk through access, then setting up the API credentials in R, and then collecting information on Twitter. That link in the chat will bring you to the GitHub page where we have all the code that I'll be using. It's relatively short, but there's some description that goes along with what we'll be doing. So it's pretty good, I think. So first, what is an API? It stands for Application Programming Interface, which doesn't really mean much on its own. But what's important about it is that it's a mechanism that lets you request controlled types and volumes of information from a website. Various websites got tired of people web scraping everything from them. And they sort of set up a framework for requesting information. It functions through URLs, so you can actually access these things manually just through a browser. That's not a very efficient way to do it. Because you can actually do that through R and Python and other languages, I assume, to really efficiently go through that process, make certain types of requests, make requests in really understandable and reproducible ways. And you can, most importantly, set up loops to do it and collect a lot of information without getting kicked out of the API, which can happen. But before you use an API, you have to sign up for the service and as a developer and obtain credentials to do it. And there's a lot of sort of rules that go along with this. One thing that I wanted to mention, because I think a lot of us have probably heard about this, if an API is set up in a bad way, you can get a lot of information about it. So if many of you have probably heard of what happened to Parler, where there was an enormous amount of information that was gathered from their website, that's actually because they had an improperly set up API that let people request literally everything without limits, and they just went for it, is the story that I've heard from a couple of the people involved. There's a few stories, some people call it hacking. Didn't actually seem like hacking. It was just a really, really bad API. So that is what is an API. So the first thing that you're gonna need to do to get access to Twitter is have a Twitter account. Next, you go to developer.twitter.com and click on apply for a developer account. It's actually fairly easy. They have some rules about restricted use cases, but I think for most of us, especially where we are now in sort of exploratory stages, that's sort of less important. So you can generally just apply for the developer account. This is the screen it takes you to. You can apply as a professional. That'll give you the enterprise level type of access if you have a ton of money to throw at it. That's generally not what we need. Hobbyist is good for just sort of exploring it, figuring it out. I signed up for a hobbyist account for developer access. It's very easy, and it's good for exploring the API and going, okay, what is this? How does it work? What can I do on this? I also signed up for a academic account as a student, which is actually very similar to the hobbyist account. It just lets you mess around with it. The particular one that you sign up for, again, depends on your use case. So if you are going to scrape data for a paper and collect a lot of data, then you should go through the process of actually going through the academic account and getting sort of properly credentialed for that. You can get different types of information, more information, as Scott said, and also you won't piss off Twitter. If you gather a lot of data and you're doing it under the wrong credentials with the wrong permissions, they might get mad at you. So it's not that common for that to happen, but it's best to be safe with that sort of thing. And if you're going to be doing an actual research project with it, sign up for a proper account. But for this particular exercise, I went with the student account. This is what it looks like. You just click Get Started. At this point, I hadn't put my phone number into my Twitter account, random string, with a bunch of random numbers after it. It was a brand new Twitter account. And it's fairly easy. You just put in your name, your country, current coding skill level, and then you just hit next. You got to give them a justification for why you want to use it. For me, it was learn to use the Twitter API, what types of information I can collect, and messing around with JSON files and sort of data management practices with it, which is true. That's what I'm going to use this for. I'm not planning on analyzing Twitter data with this account. I don't plan on actually tweeting with this account, which you can do through the API. And I don't actually plan on displaying tweets, really aggregating them outside of Twitter. This is purely for me to learn about Twitter and their API and messing around with their data. If your use case is different, put in your own information about it and in its own, whatever channel you feel is appropriate. Just hit next. Turns out this is actually a very, very easy process. You basically just hit next, you hit next, submit application. It's instant. There's no wait time for this, at least there wasn't for me twice yesterday. It is immediate that you get access. This is not a risky use case for them. There's no like mass aggregating data. There's particular limits on this type of account. They're not that worried about it, and they're not going to have people individually look over what you're doing. So you get to this page. What do you do now? There's all this stuff. What's actually useful? What you want to click on is Overview in that top left there. This is going to bring you to a page where you have projects and then standalone apps. The way that you use the API is you get a certain set of credentials. And to get those credentials, you need to create an app. And then your credentials are attached to that particular app. And that's what it's tracked through. So you hit Create App. You got to put in a name for your app. They need to be unique. That's why this one is Learning Twitter, which I just sort of mashed my hands on my number row. So it doesn't really matter what it's called. Then you get an API key and an API secret key. These two things are required for you to actually access the API. And the reason I'm doing this through PowerPoint so that I can put black bars on top of them, because if somebody else gets your API key and your API secret key, and along with two other pieces of information, they can start requesting under your credentials, which you really don't want. So it's important to keep your API key and API secret not stored in full text on your computer if you can. There's ways to do it, and you want to not share them with other people. There are mechanisms to share your API, and the way to do that is not through your API key, API secret. There's other ways to do it. So that will get you to this page where you have your app description, permissions, authentication settings. Those are great, but you really need two more pieces of information. So you click on Keys and Tokens. And what you want is the access token and secret. So you'll also see a few other things on this page where it says regenerate. You can actually only see your API key and API secret once. Twitter will not display it twice. So if you don't write them down right away and store them securely, you can't actually see them again. To display them again, Twitter will generate new ones for you, which is important because then your old ones are suddenly useless. And you'll have to go back into your code and put in your new authentication materials. But what we need here is the access token and secret. We will generate, and we get a couple more black boxes. These are actually just really long strings of random characters and numbers. And we use these to go into R or into the URL interface or whatever we're using to authenticate with the API. We need to save these two. You also don't want to share these. These are not for sharing with other people. These are important. And so we write them down, and then that's how you sign up for API access. Typically, developers and APIs will have these sorts of processes. The difficulty of signing up can be variable. It can be really hard sometimes. It can be really highly restricted. Often it is not very highly restricted. It varies pretty wildly depending on what you're trying to do and what API you're trying to get access to. But once we have our credentials, we can then start scraping stuff on Twitter. So I actually accidentally wiped my art environment. So I got to get my API credentials back in, I'm pretty sure. Let me check if this will run. Right, so this is going to take one quick second as I get my credentials back because I don't have them saved on my computer. Just a moment.
While Will works on that, does anybody have any questions about getting access to the API and getting an API key or setting up a developer's account on Twitter?
So that stuff was all added like a week ago with the academic research portion?
Yeah, the increased track for academic researchers is a recent addition. They did 2 major revisions to their API access over the past year. And the most recent one was increasing access to, or a big part of it was increasing access to academic researchers.
That's cool.
Yeah. I might be able to find the link.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that. It was just so recent. I guess one thing to keep in mind is that because a lot of this data is owned by private companies, it's generally under their purview on how researchers and other people can access it. So like things can change a lot. I think Facebook is still really, really restrictive. And like if Twitter gets into another PR scandal, they might restrict academics from accessing Twitter data. You never really know. But that's like another topic, I imagine.
Yeah, they might. Twitter's been pretty pro academics. I think it helps them stay on the good side of policy, and I think that's why they like it. Because, yeah, so many academics are doing research on Twitter. It helps them seem like, you know, Facebook kind of gets the hammer brought down on how much hate speech they're allowing to happen, but Twitter oftentimes is able to align itself with trying to combat it in a way, and I think that helps their public image. So I think it's a strategic move that they try to stay close to academics. But anyways, here's the link. So that link lists the available research tracks for different people. And it used to be that they only had like the public or premium or basically an enterprise track or a public track, but the academic research track is a recent addition.
All right, I'm good. So I will now share my screen and we'll talk about actually accessing the API on R. Here we go. Whoop. I was just about to display the things I just told you not to display. So let's go there. Cool. Just making sure it's all good. Sick. All right. So today we're going to be using the package Twitter with a capital R. And oop, is this the right one? You see it in our studio page, right? Okay, cool. Oops, something in chat. Okay, so we're going to be using Twitter.
Would you be willing to
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Would you be willing to zoom into the leftmost window with the code? It's a bit hard to see.
Oh, sorry. I've never actually tried to
tools,
zoom.
I think if you click tools
And then
and global options.
Global options.
RStudio should also have a pop-up option for that window if you go to that particular part of the grid. Because I think I see it in the top right corner. Yeah, like
Over
right
here?
there. There should be a pop-up section.
Yep.
Yeah.
Whoop.
Oh no, it doesn't pop it out. I
Yeah.
was mistaken.
I think
I've
you need to go to tools, global options,
Options.
code, or appearance.
Appearance. Zoom. Cool. I've never actually had to zoom in.
You could do that or
Let's see how
increase
this
the
one
font
is.
size.
Is that a little better? Is that
Much better.
good? Okay, cool. All right. Oh. Well, you know what? We'll roll with it. So, importantly, we're using Twitter, the package, with a capital R at the end. There are a lot of different ones. Another big one is our tweets, but this one is simpler, and it goes over the basics in a really easy to understand way. One thing to also understand about this is that Twitter, the company, has a lot of different APIs. There are many of them. They're all used for different things and give you different information in different ways. There is an API specifically for ads. There is an API for streaming information. But today we'll be focusing on the REST API. And the REST API lets you get information as sort of a snapshot of what's happening on Twitter. So you can also use it to write to Twitter to actually make posts. So if you wanted to automate something on Twitter, you could just put it in a loop and have it post to Twitter under your account every 60 seconds or however often you want it to do. But that's what you can do with the REST API. So you can look at the history, you can look at like users, user information, you can get stuff from people's profiles, which is what we'll be focusing on. And that's sort of what this particular package is for. So we have our credentials, we have our code up here. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to authenticate with the API, and we have to give it our credentials. We have to tell it we're allowed to get this stuff. Use that using the setup Twitter OAuth. You give it your API key, your API secret, access token, access secret. Again, you don't want to write these out and save them in full text if at all possible. You don't want to save them as a variable either. As soon as you get them in there, delete them. So first thing we have to do though is authenticate. I've already done that. And then we can immediately just start playing around with the Twitter API and gathering information. So the first thing that I thought would be good to do is take a look at Senator Tom Tillis's Twitter account and see what he's up to. Turns out it's pretty boring and it's pretty standard stuff, but we're going to look anyways. So we are going to define this variable. We're going to get user Senator Tom Tillis. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a look and see what this actually gets us. So when you get a user, you get a nested list almost of a bunch of information. You have, let's see, up here, this is when the account was created. Here's a description of Senator Tillis's account. Official Twitter account of North Carolina, U.S. Senator Tom Tillis. He has favorited 1,630 tweets. He's got 116,000 followers. He is following, so this friends is actually the people that he's following. 4,380 people. Here is his ID number. There is a lot of information here about Senator Thom Tillis and his Twitter account. It's a little hard to parse, but we'll get to that in a second. First, let's actually take a look and see who he is following. This might take a second. And you can use that with this here syntax. We're going to find this, his friends. So the user here is Senator Thom Tillis, this up here. And we're going to get his friends. So let's run that. Let's see his entire list of 4,000 friends. This will take a second to run because it's actually requesting the information from Twitter, and it'll actually give us all of that. It's taken a second. For what it's worth, I will not be bothering to try and get all of the people who are following him because there's a lot of them, and that would take way too long. It's thinking about it. It'll get there. This can be a fairly common thing where you are requesting information and then you're actually downloading it from Twitter or whatever API it is. Because you don't just have to request it and get it, you also have to write it to R. And R is great for some things. It is not the most efficient piece of software in the world, so sometimes R can take a minute. But it looks like it's done. And let's take a quick look and see what this is. So first, we're going to take a look at what type of data this actually is. Looks like it is a list. And then when we take a closer look at it, it is a mess to parse. If we open up one of these things here, it is a massive list that is the exact same structure as Senator Tillis. The first person who he is following is the Senator of Kansas, apparently, also a husband, father, grandfather, and a doctor, which is great. It is Dr. Roger Marshall, and he is in Great Bend, Kansas. We also, which is, I think, very interesting, get a nice little link to his profile image, which could be interesting data if you wanted to see, like, oh, what sort of profile images do people have? This just gives that to you. You can really easily loop through this and access all of the profile images. So that's what it looks like. But also, that's horrible to read through and actually make sense of. And luckily, Twitter comes with a handy-dandy command to turn this into a data frame that is much easier to actually read. So you just use the TW list to DF, and then the friends list here. And it'll give you a nice data frame that is super easy to read. But it is also taking a second because R is slow. There we go. So we are going to take a look at this, and I'll drag this over. You see the data frame here, or is it still the RStudio page? Cool. All right. So this is much easier to actually dig through. This gives us the names. Here's the description of all of his followers. Let's see who's in row 2, though. So in row 2, somebody who is representing the people of Wyoming. We'll scroll over a little bit. We get, I think that is number of tweets, number of followers, a number of favorites. They are not very active on Twitter. Only following 741 people. Who is this? Senator Cynthia Loomis. And they created their account in 2009. They were an early adopter, apparently. But the purpose of sort of showing this is that you can get a lot of information from Twitter fairly quickly. You can see if they are verified. You can find their screen name, their ID. I think this is the lists that they are on, their profile image. There's a lot of data that you get from this. And that's just a sort of one command. So what else can we get? We can see tweets that Senator Tillis, our North Carolina native, we can see what tweets he liked. So we'll do that with favorites. We're gonna pass through here Senator Tillis, that user variable from up here that we've been using. And then we'll be getting 10. And I believe this is his most recent 10 tweets. So let's see what Senator Tillis has favorited. And we'll turn this into a data frame because it is much easier to read. And we'll take a look at it. So Senator Tillis here, he tweeted something about, or favorited a tweet about a meeting with the president. It only has 40 favorites, all right. It was, looks like posted by Senator Capito, so another senator. One thing to keep in mind, one of the ways that I've seen people analyze Twitter data is through networks. You can create a lot of networks on Twitter through a lot of these different pieces of information about who is following who likes who. I briefly worked on a, sadly, a paper that didn't really turn out super well, but one of the ideas was to create sort of ideological networks of like who they are following, who are the sort of thought leaders in it. And if somebody is following, say, a lot of Republican senators, you can sort of make some sort of an argument about the ideological standing of the person. It's a little shaky, but the idea is there that you can sort of create networks of people and make inferences about them based on their sort of structure here. And there's a lot of data to work with. So what else can we get? We can see their timeline, which is another thing. So the user timeline here, which uses the exact same syntax as the favorites, it just has a slightly different function. We can see all of the tweets that appear to them. So these are the tweets that appear to them as the user. So we can actually figure out, let's do this. Yeah. See what they're seeing. So this actually looks very similar in terms of what they see on their timeline. Same meeting up here. I think there's a few things that are similar, but the point is you can find this too, and you can sort of see what the user is actually seeing themselves. We can also search for particular strings on Twitter. So if you wanted to find people talking about Parler, you can actually just search for Parler. This will also, as it turns out, get Spanish and French language tweets where I believe Parler might just be a word. Maybe there was just a lot of talk in Spanish and French media when I checked yesterday about Parler. But it was probably half of the tweets that I found there. But so we will use search Twitter function, exact same syntax. It's very simple. The first argument is Parler, the string that you're looking for. The second is how many tweets you're looking for. And this will give us a nice little data set of the most recent, or not the most recent, wanted to mention that, tweets that mention this word. So we have I believe that's French, looks French, looks French. I'm not sure. French, a lot of French, looks like Parler is just a word that shows up there. But you get all the exact same information. You get if they're replying to someone, when the tweet was created. You get the screen name, how many retweets, is it itself a retweet? You get a lot of information. And if it's enabled, you can potentially get latitude and longitude. Kind of rare to actually get those. People turn that off generally. So you can get that. One thing to note about this, though, is that it is a sample of tweets that you get, and it is not the most recent ones. It is not a truly random sample either. Last I heard, nobody really knew how Twitter selected for the API. It didn't seem truly random. So that presents the obvious problems of actually sampling, and you don't actually know what the bias of your sampling procedures are. So if you use this, you got to be a little careful about that, but I'm not sure how the academic Twitter one works or sort of how that would work if that's a sort of different procedure. But for the REST API with this sort of very casual one, last I heard, it's not actually truly random. Another thing, tags, and you do it in the exact same way. We can find the people who are tweeting at Senator Tillis. Fingers crossed, nobody is too mad currently, but let's see what we get here. Hopefully nothing horrible. So this first one, looks like somebody might be a little mad at Senator Tillis. Dan Leol might be a little angry at Senator Tillis for some reason. Something about the GOP. Another person who's kind of angry about Senator Tillis and his voting record. The point is you can find people talking to other people, get a lot of information about it. The syntax is very simple. It's very accessible to sort of explore, and you get very, very powerful tools relatively easily. And it's very, maybe not very, but relatively clean data too. It's pretty easy to work with. Last thing that I want to talk about is rate limiting. So as I've been doing this, Twitter has been keeping track of how much information these credentials have been requested. If I go over that rate limit, I will be locked out of the API and I can't make those requests until it resets. The rate limit is something that you can actually look at. So to find this using the Twitter package, use this function get cure rate limit info, and it'll give you this huge list. Each of these things is a particular request, the limit, how many there are remaining, and when it resets. This is really important to know so that if you are automating collection, you can put your collection in a loop and not hit the rate limit. You time it so that you are just under the rate limit and you don't get kicked out. Also important is that the rate limit itself, that call, that is part of the rate limit. There's a limit of how many times you can ask Twitter per, I forget what the window is, but per whatever amount of time, you can only ask Twitter for the rate limit X amount of times. Everything that you can ask for is rate limited in some fashion. This is how Parler messed up a lot. Last I heard, they didn't really have a rate limit. They just let people request whatever they wanted, as much as they wanted. Turns out that can be a huge problem. Most developers are a little smarter than that, and they have some sort of limitations on it. The final thing is that there is this very handy website, Programmable Web, that you can actually search for APIs on. They have about 13,000 of them listed, and they have links to documentation on them, and it's a very handy resource for looking up different websites, what their APIs are. Are they a REST API or a streaming API? It has a lot of information. For example, I looked up Glassdoor. That has an API. That could have some really cool data about sort of hiring and there's a lot of cool stuff on there if you want to look through it. And that's a really useful resource for if you have a project in mind, you can just look up if there's an API for it. The second, another last thing is that you can do this through R and Python through the URL system too. It is not that difficult to do. There are many instructions out there. We just don't have the time today to go over them, sadly. But just because there is no package in R or Python to access an API, that doesn't mean you can't do it. You just have to do a little bit more work ahead of time and then deal with parsing the data in particular ways, which is not actually, as it turns out, that hard. Most APIs use a JSON data structure. It's very clean, very easy to deal with. So if there is an API and there's no package to deal with it, it's just a tiny bit more effort to actually get the information that you want. And that was timed just about perfectly. And that is where I will end.
Does anybody have any questions for Will about that very informative presentation?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could just explain what you meant just at the very end by like the URL instead.
Sure. So to access the, let's just use the Google Maps API as an example. To access the Google Maps API, you can actually just type a URL into your web browser. And there are particular fields where you would type in certain things for your search in their API. You have to input your credentials to let the Google Maps API know that you're allowed to get this information. That will tell the Google Maps API how much and what types of information you can get. And then there are certain fields in the URL that you would put in, and it would then give you an output of data. So it's literally just a very specific URL that you would use to do it.
So just as we wrap up here, I also wanted to send a link to this R package, which is designed to efficiently parse JSON files from Twitter. And one of the things you saw in Will's presentation is it takes a little while to work. And part of the reason for that is data frames are an inefficient data structure. Data tables are much more efficient. So the nice thing about that R package is it does all the data wrangling for you, and it does it with data tables. So it claims to be able to parse about 2 million tweets in under 5 minutes and get it into a nice structure for you. So that might be worthwhile looking into. I also know the guy who wrote it, and he's a nice guy. So do it for my friend. Anyways. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming again. I think this is a great first meeting. Thanks, Will, for putting it together, and Todd for all your help organizing it. The next